The place where facts and opinions meet in the capital. The Rob Snow Show returns on 1310 News. Filling in, here's Sam Laprade.
Thank you so much for being with us here on 1310 News. We have Fareed Khan here to talk about a very, very challenging subject today, and we wanted to get his thoughts. Fareed, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. You're from Canadians United Against Hate, and we're certainly seeing a very disturbing arrest of a Quebec man calling for genocide against Muslims. You're indicating here that you're wanting the federal government to act on an anti-hate strategy, and this is really timely for us, of course, coming out of so many of the protests recently. Talk to me a little bit about how this all happened.
In terms of the strategy, you mean?
Right.
Yes. Well, I and other members of particularly the Muslim community began approaching the federal government back just after the shootings in Quebec City, at the Quebec City Mosque in January 2017. We started talking with MPs and cabinet ministers about there needs to be some sort of coordinated strategy at the federal level, because we had been seeing rising incidents of hate, not just against Muslims, but against Jews and other communities across the country. And this has been going on for quite some time. Of course, in the aftermath of the shootings at the Quebec City Mosque in 2017, there was a motion presented in the House of Commons, M103, and it was a motion to address Islamophobia. And what was the result of that motion? A lot more Islamophobia, not just in terms of public demonstrations, but also in terms of responses by the opposition to the motion.
It really is. It really is heartbreaking to see when we see that a man from Quebec charged with advocating genocide. Did this come as a surprise to you?
I'm sad to say no, because this is not the first time this has happened. Back in December of 2019, there were two other Quebecers who were arrested for threatening Muslims also and calling for genocide. And then there was a man who was charged in January of this year for inciting, and once again from Quebec, for inciting hatred against Jews and other communities. So this is not a new phenomenon. This has been going on for some time, and unfortunately, while we see a lot of nice words and platitudes from politicians, we are not seeing the level of action that's needed, aggressive action to address hate and white supremacy. And we're not the only ones who are saying this. Back as early as 2015, CSIS put out a report which said that the biggest national security threat to Canada was not foreign-inspired terrorism, but white supremacist and far-right militia groups in Canada.
Wow, it's really that's really interesting. When we think about the recommendations that you want to make, if you had, let's say, 10 minutes with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, what recommendations would you suggest that the federal government make to anti-racism, the proposal that was made, for instance, in 2019?
Well, the main recommendations that we had put out there was that the government launch an aggressive anti-hate, anti-racism strategy, taking an all-of-government approach, not too dissimilar from the way that the government has approached the COVID-19 pandemic, because racism, essentially, it's a social disease, and it needs to be addressed with an all-of-government approach. In addition, we talked about, of course, addressing the whole issue of systemic racism, not just within, governments and public agencies, but broadly across society. Because one of the things that is troubling is not just the fact that this racism happening in society, but it's also the way that it's sort of insidiously part of business culture in Canada, and also, sadly, for example, within the media itself, because the way media covers stories is a very big part of the issue. And I cite, for example, the way the issue was covered of the intruder at Rideau Hall last week. or a week or so ago, where he arrived fully armed, and the way he was dealt with by police, as opposed to the way unarmed people who have been killed by police across the country, and the way those stories were covered. So requires an all of government and all of society approach. Were
you surprised when the RCMP came out originally had indicated they didn't think there was systemic racism?
You know what? I like every time I hear that, it's like, what kind of world are you living in that you can't see what's obviously there? And when the RCMP commissioner came out and said that, all I could do was shake my head, because this is something that has been reported on, that has been studied to death for years and years. There's all kinds of literature and academic research out there showing the existence of systemic racism, and yet we have people in positions of power, and they're primarily white, who just can't seem to, see the picture that's painted before them.
Really interesting, because we know that many people that are doing these crimes are doing them on social media. What ways do we have to monitor that, Fareed?
Well, the same way that I guess it's monitored, in terms of criminal activity. There is an infrastructure within the RCMP, within the Communication Security Establishment, within CSIS, that monitors online chatter. They've been doing it for years. They basically put in place the infrastructure in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and they've been monitoring those voices that are adherents of ISIS or Al-Qaeda ideology, and it's the same sort of technology and approach that needs to be taken to white supremacy, which is a bigger threat to Canadians than is foreign-inspired terrorism. The tools are there. The infrastructure is there. It's just a matter of redirecting priorities, because right now the vast majority of the effort and the resources are still being directed towards monitoring foreign terrorist threats.
The important discussions that we've had recently, of course, in recent weeks regarding race, do you think the needle has been moved at all, Fareed, in your opinion?
For the first time in my life, I think, yes, it has. We have never seen this level of public engagement on the issue of racism, and it's a very I get a very positive feeling from the public reactions that I'm seeing in terms of all the demonstrations that have taken place, in terms of the responses that I've seen on social media about addressing racism and hate in Canadian society. And the politicians better listen. This is not going to be one of those moments that is going to fade away, and certainly not in terms of what activists are going to do. We finally seem to have some level of political and public engagement, and we're not going to let it fade away, as happened after for example, the release of the blackface and brownface photos during the election, and the incident with a couple of Conservative MPs that Andrew Scheer did not respond to. This is a movement that's taking place. We're at a seminal moment in history, not just in Canada, but seems to be around the world, and politicians who ignore what the public is calling for and what activists are calling for are going to pay a political price at the ballot box.
What are you hoping allies do during this time, Fareed, to support any of this moving forward? If we have listeners right now at 1310 News that say, you know what, I want to help move this forward, this important discussion, what suggestions do you have for them?
Well, I think that calling out racism wherever you see it, whether it's, you see it from politicians or in the media or, at your workplace, even within your own family, call it out and call it out for what it is, because unfortunately we've been too polite in the past by, remaining silent when we've seen racism. To get involved in community organizations who are working to try and counter racism, continue to put pressure on the politicians to do something, because racism is like a brush fire. Once it starts, you don't know whether it's just going to scorch a field or destroy an entire forest and everything that stands in its way. That's the way we have to see racism, and we have to do everything we can to put out the brush fire before it scorches all of society.
We're speaking with Fareed Khan, from Canadians United Against Hate. Does this not also really impact our children? I mean, is this an opportunity for you to take a point in time and say, moving forward, the education of our children has to include the topic of racism?
Definitely. One of the recommendations that was presented to the government in the report that I worked on included working with provincial governments to put in place curriculum in the school program that looks at issues of racism, that it looks at the issue of the racist history of Canada, that studies the fact that we have a country that sits on land that was that belonged to a people against whom genocide was committed. We need to put this information in the heads of our children to help them to understand how we came to be where we are. Because what we are seeing in terms of systemic racism, in terms of white supremacy, is a continuation of a legacy of colonialism and white supremacy which created this country. And even though we'd like to say or think that we've evolved, the fact is that that ideology still is rooted in many of the institutions and the way that society has evolved over the last 100 or so years.
We know that, we've talked a little bit about the issues with police, and you're also seeing it in the justice system as well, Fareed?
Oh, definitely. All you have to do is look at the incarceration rates of Canada in prisons across Canada. Indigenous people, even though they represent slightly less than 5% of the Canadian population, they represent over 25% of the people who have been imprisoned. Black Canadians, who represent around 3% of the population, have incarceration rates of over 9%. And all you can do is look at the statistics about how Indigenous and blacks and people of color tend to be treated more hostilely by police. They are more often pulled over. They're more often questioned. So yes, there is a clear example within Canada's justice system about where racism exists. And once again, this is not new information. This information has been studied to death by academics for decades. And hopefully now that we've seen this rising awareness in Canada to address racism, that we will see some of these issues tackled in a way that addresses the root of the problem.
Fareed Khan, Canadians United Against Hate. Appreciate your time today and appreciate your perspective, and definitely hope we move that needle and get to a better place sometime soon. And really appreciate your time. Fareed
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for covering the subject.
Thank you so much. Stay with us here on 1310 News.